Memphis, Tennessee, 1852. On a morning choked with heat and flies, a scream rose over Whitaker Plantation and settled like smoke across the fields. 10-year-old Elijah was branded with the letter W, not by accident, not by punishment, but by decree. It was the will of Silas Whitaker, master of over 200 souls, that the boy wear his name in iron. And so it was done. Flesh sizzled, smoke curled, and the boy's silence began. The fire had been prepared in the iron pot just before dawn. Coals raked evenly, flames fed with resin and pine fat. The branding iron lay nestled in the center, its shaft humming red. 2 overseers held Elijah down against the punishment stump, the one still dark with old scorch marks and clotted blood. His shirt had already been torn. The W had already been forged. The sentence had already been passed. His mother, Dinah, saw the fire from the far side of the yard and ran without thought. Her feet bled across the gravel. Her apron flared behind her like a flag. "My boy!" she screamed. She threw herself forward, but too late. The iron was already pressed to Elijah's bare shoulder, and the scream that followed carved the air in two. Dinah reached him just as the sear lifted, her hands catching the smoke rising from her child's skin. They beat her with the thick end of a rifle, and she fell beside him, gasping, whispering his name through cracked lips. Elijah's father, Moses, came from the stable like a bolt of ash, sprinting full force toward the stump. He made it no farther than the base of the old elm. A single word from Whitaker, and the rope was brought out. No trial, no pause. The limb had been used before. Before the hour passed, Moses hung lifeless beneath the tree, his shadow swinging long across the cracked earth. All of it happened beneath a clear sky, the sun indifferent, the birds silent. It was a day made for planting, for harvest, for baptisms and weddings. But that morning, it became a day of smoke and scars. When night came, the moon was a cut of milk glass high over quarters. Elijah lay fevered on a straw mat, the scar on his shoulder pulsing like a second heartbeat. His eyes were open, but he made no sound. He hadn't cried during the branding. He didn't cry now. Hester, his grandmother, wiped his brow with cloth steeped in river mint and wild chamomile. Her voice barely moved the air. "The letter is theirs," she whispered, her fingers hovering just above the wound. "But the name is yours." She lit no candle, fearing the master's eyes. Only the embers burned faint, casting red across Elijah's skin. The letter W looked less like a mark of ownership and more like a brand of warning. Not to him, but to the house that had carved it. The plantation did not pause. By morning, the whip cracked as it always did. Corn had to be shelled, laundry scrubbed, floors polished, mouths fed. Elijah did not return to the field. He was too small, too scarred. Instead, he was assigned to the kitchen, then to the stables, then to errands between the house and the yard. He became a shadow that moved when told but spoke nothing, a mute boy with burn-scarred flesh and eyes that missed nothing. He learned which door hinges groaned and which did not, which floorboards creaked in the east hallway, and which stayed quiet even under weight. He learned the times of the mail deliveries, the rhythm of the house bell, the rotation of the overseer's patrols. He counted keys. He studied locks. He remembered voices. Elijah's silence made him invisible, and invisibility made him powerful. In the attic of the house, where the air stank of mothballs and forgotten linens, he found books with broken spines. He could not read them, but he turned their pages anyway. He traced the letters. He copied them in dust. W, 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 over and over, not as submission, as study. At night, he listened to Hester hum the songs of the old coast, songs from before ships, before chains. Her voice never rose louder than breath, but it filled the room. She told no stories aloud, but Elijah learned them all, of the mountain that hid warriors, of the sea that swallowed slave ships whole, of the tree that held the souls of the hanged until justice came. The elm outside the quarters had taken many bodies, she said, but it remembered, and so did Elijah. On the anniversary of the branding, Hester gave him something wrapped in burlap, an old cloth bundle buried under floorboards. Inside was the blade his father once carried as a stableman. The handle was smooth with age, the edge still sharp enough to test a breath. "Don't take it in anger," she told him. "Take it in memory." He said nothing, just nodded. The blade disappeared beneath the floor again, but not forgotten. One day, when he was 12, he saw a wedding veil arrive by carriage, ivory silk, stitched with lace, folded over bone-colored gloves. With it came trunks from Virginia, and crates not of linen, but of iron. Elijah watched as a new mistress, young, pale, with a mouth too small for the words she spoke, stepped down into the dust. Her name was Margaret Vale, and she would soon marry the master. The plantation buzzed with preparation. Flowers were ordered, silver polished, musicians summoned, but Elijah marked other things. He saw the cellar where wine was kept, and how the master lingered over the third bottle from the right. Bordeaux, always the same. He saw where the shackles were stored behind the smokehouse, now cleaned and labeled for decorative use. He saw the way the overseers wore their coats tighter, their guns looser, and then one evening, Hester placed a pinch of something dark and grainy into his hand. "It burns not the throat," she said, "but the will." She wrapped it in parchment and pressed it into his palm. Only enough for one man. Choose the moment. He nodded, and when he returned to the attic, he touched the blade once more. The branding had marked the beginning, but not the ending. The letter still burned, yes, but not as a wound, as a warning to them. The next chapter would be the master's wedding. But Elijah had already written the first line. Memphis, Tennessee, autumn 1852. It was not his daughter's wedding, but his own. Silas Whitaker, Lord of the Cotton, ruler of Ledger and Lash, had decided to take a wife. The whispers said she was from Virginia, Margaret Vale, young, quiet, raised behind curtains and etiquette. She arrived in a long black carriage drawn by white mares, the sun catching her veil like smoke and water, with her cane satin trunks filled with lace and perfume. And in a second cart, iron crates bolted with chain. They did not hide what was inside. Shackles polished like jewelry, iron masks lined in velvet, bit gags bound in silk ribbon. She called them artifacts. He called them tradition. Together, they were a vow of order. Preparations began the moment she stepped down into Whitaker soil. The big house swelled with movement. Field hands were summoned to cut pine branches. House girls scrubbed the white columns until their knuckles cracked. The men were given new shirts. The women were made to smile. Elijah watched it all, silently. The burn on his shoulder had turned into a black scar that curled under his collarbone. It ached in the morning, but he no longer flinched. He moved between kitchen and stable, cellar and parlor, invisible to guests but known by the doors. He learned quickly. The wine for the feast was kept in the lower cellar, through the east hallway, past the locked door. The key hung on a nail above the fireplace, always unattended after dusk. Whitaker's favorite bottle sat on the third shelf on the right, a 1839 Bordeaux, corked with red wax, neck chipped from age. He took note of it, not with longing but with precision. Every part of the house had begun to speak to him, in patterns and shadows, in the pauses between boots on floorboards. In the quarters, Hester watched too. She counted hours, not tasks. On the eve of the wedding, she sat beside the fire with a bundle wrapped in old cloth. "Tonight," she said, "he drinks, he dances, he lifts his glass, and the drink will fall through him like water through grave dirt." Elijah sat still. Hester opened the cloth. Inside, his father's knife. Iron, bone-handled, stained but whole. The blade was narrow and sharp, meant for leather but baptized in blood. "Don't strike from anger," she told him, her voice low and heavy. "Strike from debt. Return it in the name of those taken." He took the knife. She unwrapped another bundle, a small pouch of powder, black and dull. "Just a pinch," she whispered, "in his wine. Not too much. You want him weak, not dead. Not until your hand says so." That night, while the wedding musicians tuned their strings and candles burned in waxy silence, Elijah stepped into the cellar. The east hallway was quiet. The key above the fireplace felt warm in his hand, like something waiting to be used. The door opened without a groan. The bottle was there, third from the right. the chip-neck Bordeaux. He opened it with care, poured out a splash into the drain, then tipped the pouch. The powder sank like regret. He swirled it once, sealed it, replaced the bottle. No sound, no witness. Only the wine knew. Outside, the altar had been raised. They built it over the roots of the elm. The same tree where Elijah's father had hung, where others had bled before rope was law. But now it was draped in linen, decked with roses and called sacred. Chairs stood in rows, white sashes fluttering the autumn breeze. Lanterns hung from branches like fireflies pinned in glass. Margaret stood at the house steps, a veil like frost over her face. Her dress trailed behind her like ash. She said nothing as the preacher read, as Silas lifted his hand to take hers. Elijah stood with the other servants, a silver tray in hand, his eyes fixed on the tree. The elm was watching. Silas raised his glass. The wine met his lips. The Bordeaux touched his tongue, and the will began to fade. His hand shook. The color drained from his face. The preacher stumbled in his verse. Margaret turned toward him, confused, then angry. He tried to speak, but the words came out wet. One step back. Another. His fingers opened. The glass shattered. Elijah moved. Not fast, not loud. With calm. The tray fell. He crossed the space between servants and master, like wind through grass. At the altar's brazier, a fire iron burned red. He lifted it. The brand glowed in the night air. He pressed it to Whitaker's white glove. The hiss was louder than the music. The smell of burning leather curled around them. Then Elijah spoke. "Take back what you gave." And the knife, his father's knife, the blade of memory and bone, found Whitaker's chest. It did not strike wild. It struck center. The master fell. The altar shook. The tree did not move. Guests screamed. Music collapsed. The white chair scattered like bones. Margaret ran. But Elijah followed. Memphis, Tennessee, autumn 1852. The altar trembled. It was built on roots that remembered. The old elm had borne too much. Ropes, weight, blood, wind. Now it bore witness. Beneath it, vows had been promised, wine raised, and a white glove burned through by the same iron once pressed to Elijah's skin. Silas Whitaker had fallen into the dust, his mouth twisted not in speech, but in failure. And from his chest, the knife still stood upright, bone-handled, memory sharpened, driven by a boy who never forgot. Guests screamed. Women scattered in satin and panic. Men reached for weapons, but found none. The hired band fled first, instruments clutched like infants. The fire crackled from the brazier. The rope on the elm swayed in the wind. Empty, Margaret Vale, now Margaret Whitaker in name only, ran toward the house. She clutched her skirts, then the veil, then the bottle, the very same third from the right Bordeaux that had not yet touched lips. She hadn't eaten. The poison moved faster. Elijah followed, not hurried, not hunted. He walked, barefoot over broken glass and spilled wine, his steps soundless in the chaos. The white chairs had overturned like dying birds. A ribbon caught fire in the breeze. He did not look back at Silas. That name had ended. That debt was paid. Inside the house, Margaret staggered. Her hand trembled. Her mouth foamed. She reached the threshold. Elijah stepped to the front door behind her, the knife still red. Margaret turned, her eyes wide, her lips parted. He looked at her the way one looks at a storm. "A white dress is no shield for blood," he said. The blade struck once. Deep, final. She collapsed against the parlor wall, a smear of red on her gown. She died without screaming. Then Elijah turned toward the master's study. The ledgers that they always had. On the mahogany desk, beside the iron box of keys, beneath a framed map of cotton fields drawn like conquest. He lit the lantern with care. He opened the drawer. He poured the oil. Page by page, he fed the fire. Contracts, bills of sale, loan records, manumission denials. Ink became smoke. Signatures became ash. The room filled with heat and memory. Behind him, the servants had gathered in the hall. Field hands. House girls. Stable boys. None stepped forward. None ran. They stood shoulder to shoulder. The firelight danced across their eyes. Elijah did not speak to them. He didn't need to. The fire spoke for him. The blaze grew. It reached the hall. It licked the portraits. It blackened the family crest. Outside, the wedding ribbons caught flame and curled in the air like ghosts returning to the sky. Overseers shouted, but the hands did not move. They watched the big house burn. Memphis, Tennessee, autumn 1852. Margaret's body slumped against the parlor wall, her white dress blooming red. The fire behind Elijah reached upward now, breathing like something born. Its shadows writhed across the wallpaper, made the portraits blink, turned the lace curtains to smoke. Yet still the field hands stood quiet, their eyes reflecting flame, their bodies unmoved, as if they had seen this fire long before it came. Elijah did not look at them. He stepped over the edge of Margaret's train, past the hall table where wedding gifts still lay unopened. A silver vase, an ivory fan, a lace-bound Bible. He touched none of them. Instead, he moved toward the cellar door. One by one, he descended the stone steps. Down in the cool dark, rows of bottles glimmered. The same cellar where he dropped the powder into the Bordeaux. But he had no wine to fetch now, only flame to feed. He broke each bottle against the wall. Red wine poured like blood. It soaked the floor, the beams, the splinters. He scattered the remains of a cask. Then he lit a small scrap of curtain and dropped it into the spill. Fire roared up the wall. Back upstairs, panic had ripened. The overseers ran to fetch water, but the buckets were small, the blaze too quick. One screamed orders. The rest looked for exits. A few grabbed rifles, though no shots rang. The flames were too fast, the air too thick. Still, no field hand moved. Still, no one touched Elijah. He passed him again, now blackened by soot. His clothes were soaked in wine, in ash, in blood not his own. His eyes reflected no horror, no triumph, only the steady rhythm of a task completed. His hands were empty now. He no longer needed the blade. The fire had taken the burden. Outside, the smoke curled into the autumn sky. Sparks leapt onto the drapes of the master's chamber, the linens of the bridal bed. The mattress ignited like dry moss. The veil curled into nothing. The wedding had ended. He stepped through the doorway into the night air. Margaret's body still lay in the parlor. Silas Whitaker's corpse remained under the elm, his blood drying in the dirt where the altar had stood. The preacher had long since fled. The ribbon chairs melted in rows. The instruments lay silent in the grass. Elijah walked toward the barn. He opened the storage door where shackles were kept, the iron masks, the gags, the collars with rusted teeth. He gathered them in silence. One by one, he dragged them to the fire. The flames did not resist. They welcomed the metal like kin. They hissed as the iron boiled. Chains blackened, then twisted, then fell into molten shapes that no longer fit neck or wrist. The bit gags curled inward, like tongues returned to silence. The collars melted into the ground. Only ash remained. The feast had turned. No meat, no bread, no wine, only fire and smoke, and the quiet consent of those who had lived too long beneath the lash. A young house girl, no older than 9, stood by the steps. Her face was smudged. She held a doll with no eyes. Elijah passed her. She looked up and said nothing. From the yard, the other servants watched the windows break, watched the flames take the library, the drawing room, the nursery. A small boy reached out and took his sister's hand. The firelight danced on their skin. No one wept. Somewhere in the distance, horses screamed. The overseers had fled. Not all would escape. The road was long, and the fields knew every name. One fell into the cane. One drowned in the flooded ditch. One disappeared into the swamp and was never seen again. But Elijah did not chase. His work was here. He returned to porch, where Hester now stood. Her hands were folded. Her eyes, red from smoke, did not blink. He nodded once. She looked past him to the house, to the rising pyre that had once been a roof, a ceiling, a throne. She did not smile. But the lines around her eyes deepened, not with joy but with memory. "It's done," she said. He looked at the sky. The stars had disappeared behind smoke. But morning was coming, and it would come to a house burned clean. Memphis, Tennessee, autumn 1852. By morning, the Whitaker house was ash. The chimney stood like a spine. The veranda had collapsed. The grand staircase was a charcoal rib cage twisted in ruin. Even the weather vanes had melted. The old elm, still black-fingered and watching, cast its long shadow over scorched grass and smoke. Beneath it, where the altar once stood, the soil was red with memory. Elijah stood in the yard, barefoot, his shirt open to breeze that carried soot like snowfall. His shoulder still bore the W, but it was no longer a brand. It was a scar now, a wound that had finished speaking. Around him, the others emerged from the quarters, slow, silent, as if unsure whether they still walked the same world. Mothers carried children wrapped in quilts. Men stood with hands still calloused from work, but loose now, unburdened. No whip cracked, no orders barked, no bell rang. They stood not in rebellion, but in something older, a stillness that came after the storm, when the trees count their branches and the ground exhales. Then came the sound of hooves. Soldiers, 4, then 6, then more, rode in from the East Road. Blue uniforms, polished buttons. Federal men, drawn by the smoke, the fire, the absence of command. Their horses kicked dust over the edge of the ruined steps. They dismounted. They expected resistance. Guns, riot, retaliation. But all they found was a boy without chains. A man, really, barefoot, bloody, standing in front of a house he did not build but had just buried. They raised rifles. Elijah did not move. The captain stepped forward. His face was lined with war, his eyes too tired for judgment. "What happened here?" he asked. No answer. Elijah turned and walked. Past the elm, past the altar's remains, past the soldiers, who parted without meaning to. He walked toward the river. Behind him, the field hands remained silent. They made no gesture of surrender, no plea, just watched. Some followed. Most did not. They knew what had been done and why. The captain lowered his weapon. There was no law for this, no sentence, no language to contain what had happened. The fire still smoldered. The ash still fell. But Elijah did not look back. He stepped into the tall reeds at the river's edge. He knelt. He took off his shirt. He tore the fabric in strips and bound his hands. Then he reached into the water and scrubbed. The soot, the wine, the blood. He let the river take it, not to forget, but to mark the end. The W remained, of course. The skin does not forget that easily. But it was no longer his. It belonged to the fire. From the hill, Hester watched. She had not followed. She did not need to. She had seen enough boys walk to the river and never return. But this one walked away with everything still intact. His silence, his name, his story. Some said later that the house had been cursed. Others said it was a slave revolt, though no one could name more than one killer. The official report, penned weeks later by a man who had never stepped foot on Whitaker land, called an isolated act of violence, likely madness. But in the fields, the story grew tall. Children whispered it at dusk. Elders sang it low, beneath breath, when no one watched. The story of Elijah of Memphis, the boy with the brand, the man who turned a wedding into a reckoning, who killed a master and his bride with blade and flame, who burned the ledgers and fed the fire every name ever written in ink but never in truth, the boy who said nothing and yet left every word behind in smoke. In time, even the name Whitaker faded. The land was sold, divided, repurposed. Cotton still grew, the elm still stood, but no house rose there again. No family reclaimed it. Only the roots remembered. 1 year later, a ring was found in the reeds by a child hunting frogs. A gold band, blackened, twisted by heat. It was thrown back into the water. Because memory does not need metal to endure. Because some names are better left drowned. Elijah was never seen again. But he was never gone. He became the name field hands whispered to scare overseers. The story passed from quarter to quarter, told only in pieces. The silent boy, the fire, the vow, the river. It was said that whenever a master raised a hand in punishment, Somewhere far off a wind would rise, and someone would say, "He walked through fire once. He will walk again." And so they waited, not for saviors, for silence, for the day the fire would come again, dressed in ash and memory, with no name but justice.